Right. Okay.
Good news. Good news. Good news. Hello, and welcome back to the PEPtalk podcast. I'm your host, Mark, and on this episode, I sit down with my friend and fellow PPE second year, Dom Smith, for an interview with University of York alum, author, and the lead political columnist at the Mail on Sunday, Peter Hitchens. Dom and I asked him about free speech issues at university, Brexit, and a few other topics. He also shared some advice on how to lead a career in journalism or politics, but it was really general advice for a successful career. Now, there's no getting around the fact that Peter Hitchens is a controversial figure. But I started this podcast with the goal of talking with people within the disciplines of PPE coming from diverse backgrounds with a wide range of views. I think you'll find this conversation to be both engaging and lively, but that's enough selling it for me. Let's hear from the man himself. All right. So thank you, Peter Hitchens, for coming on the podcast. We're happy to talk to you. And
well, so far it's a pleasure. We'll see how that goes.
I suppose we will.
Okay, so my question, Peter, I'm Dom Smith, by the way. Nice to speak to you. My question, first of all, is, reading about you, I've heard you described as both a Burkean conservative and also as a social democrat. They seem to me to be quite at odds with each other. So, can they be reconciled?
Well, all these things are nonsense, really. Edmund Burke was, in fact, a Whig, not a Tory, and so to describe as a conservative is complicated in the first place. And social democracy is a very broad church, a bit like the Church of England, or rather what the Church of England used to be. And in my case, what it means is a willingness to recognise that the state has a role in making sure that people don't fall below certain standards and in organising things which cannot conceivably be done by private individuals or indeed by private companies. Take, for example, one of my favourite subjects, the railways. You couldn't really have a functioning railway system at this stage in our civilization unless the state managed it. Attempts to do so without it never work. Nor could you have armed forces. It seems to me that having once accepted that, you can accept the various other things can be tackled by the state, including the welfare state, to some extent pensions, education, public transport, I said, housing, and that makes me a social democrat. I also think that if you're seriously concerned with keeping society, how shall I put it, in a state where it can remain stable, where people can live reasonably free lives under the rule of law, the chances are you're going to have to do things like that in the modern world. So in a way, I like to confuse people who want to categorize me as one thing or another, but I think it would be difficult to say that I wasn't a social democrat if you looked at the things that I supported. Though it doesn't mean that I endorsed the program of any particular party.
So
as for Burkean conservative, and that's really shorthand for saying that you believe that people should, as far as possible, be allowed to live under their own consciences and to be directed by their own consciences rather than being ordered about by officials enforcing an external law. The most fundamental point which Burke made was that the more men were prepared to govern themselves, the less the state would need to govern them. And I think that's very important and something which we should bear in mind, because that takes you to the next stage of the argument, which is how are men going to decide to govern themselves? I believe that this is best done by a widespread observance of the Christian religion, particularly the Protestant version of it. But that is probably a subject for another day you want to discuss. But all these things lock together into a basic belief that men are free to the extent that they are willing to control themselves, and that one should try and create a society in which they can be as free as possible and make their own decisions as far as possible. I think that there's no such thing as an ideal society, but that seems to me to be the most desirable form.
Okay, so I suppose...
Does that make sense?
It does. So I suppose you're reconciling it in that sense, that it's a mixture of civil liberties in a kind of social aspect, and then slight economic intervention where necessary.
Yes, well, I don't think Well, I'm absolutely not as one of these people who calls himself a libertarian. Libertarianism is nonsense. The idea that freedom could be made into a principle is absurd. As Karl Marx correctly said, no man fights against freedom. He fights against the freedom of others and for his own. And often freedoms will conflict. If you make freedom into a principle, you'll get chaos and probably license as well. So you have to work out a society in which it's practically possible for men and women to be as free as possible, and not least because people grow more as human beings, the more they're able to take their own decisions and to have that freedom. But ultimately, all freedom has to be based on a form of order. And if that form of order is destroyed by economic catastrophe, by millions of people being so poor, so workless, so uneducated, they can't actually function as proper citizens of a civilized society, what's the point of that? So if you really want that to happen, you have to be able to provide the safety nets and the restraints which create the possibility of freedom.
If I could push you on something that you said sort of near the beginning, that the sort of political ideologies that Dom mentioned, the sort of Burkean conservatism and the sort of the liberal aspects of your beliefs, you said that they're sort of nonsense. What exactly did you mean by that? Is it that the sort of political labels are putting people in boxes too much or used to castigate people? Or is it just that there's no utility in using political labels these days? Where sort of do you fall on that?
There's some use in it, but they shouldn't be taken too far. And to try and elevate Edmund Burke into a political philosopher, I think will strain your mind. It's not really what he was. The message of his greatest work, The Reflection on the Revolution in France, is a huge mistrust of utopianism, which doesn't have all that much to do with, you could connect it up, but it's not really the same thing as his statement that freedom depends on our willingness to restrain ourselves. He thought profoundly about things and said some very intelligent things rather beautifully, but I don't think there's a philosophy there. And as for social democracy, I find that the officially left-wing parties in most Western countries, so the Democrats in the United States, the socialists in France, the SPD in Germany, and the Labour Party in Britain, have almost entirely moved away from the old social democratic principles of providing for the welfare of the poor that they were built on, and they no longer follow that. So it doesn't mean anything if it's simply considered as a term. It's a starting point for an explanation, I think.
I'd like to ask you about free speech in universities, because I have a feeling that'll be something that you have, I assume, a reasonably strong opinion about. So last week, the government introduced a piece of legislation that will enable speakers who are censored or no platformed to sue universities on the grounds of infringement of free speech. What do you make of that proposed law?
Well, I think it's probably a complete waste of time. It's the Conservative Party trying to join a campaign which I think suits a part of its voter base that it's realised it's been neglecting. I doubt very much whether these provisions could ever be activated. And in any case, what they do is they run against an enormous tide in the academy, which believes very strongly that freedom of speech is actually something which needs to be restrained. I grew up on the basis that everybody believed in the freedom of speech and that it was a good thing accepted by everybody in this country. I now know that that's not the case. Very large numbers of people think that freedom of speech of the sort that I would like is a danger, an indulgence to bad people, and something they're very happy to put limits on. They're not ashamed of doing so. And the fascinating thing about modern universities is how shameless they are about trying to limit free speech. And I don't think that anything other than a cultural and moral revolution or counter-revolution as big as the one we've experienced in the last 50 years can change that. I certainly don't think a few gestures by a Tory government can alter it. So no, I think this is something which has happened and continues to happen, and you're not going to fight it like that. And in general, my view is that the battle has been lost. And I always draw the contrast in free speech discussions between myself now, somebody so wicked that a university can actually no platform me, or in one case where I decided I would rather speak in the open air than undergo the inquisition that was demanded before I spoke at Liverpool, from having been a Trotskyist, intolerant horror, who back in 1972, I think it was, tried very hard to prevent the Professor Hans Eysenck from speaking at the University of York, which I did. The interesting thing then was that there were huge numbers of people at the University of York, both among the lecturers and among the students, who strongly disapproved of me and my fellow zealots as we tried to stop Professor Eysenck from speaking. Nowadays, there's very little opposition to it at all.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And I think it leads sort of naturally to a discussion of sort of very popular and somewhat contentious issue, which is the sort of notion of hate speech. And whenever there's a sort of discussion of free speech today, it seems like there is a pushback that comes from, I mean, a very understandable perspective of wanting to limit the amount of hateful speech that people are subject to, people have to sort of listen to, be even degraded by in some circumstances. How far do you see a role for the definition of hate speech, who defines hate speech within our sort of modern political dialogue? Or should it just be free speech, that's the end of it, we shouldn't even be talking about hate speech?
Well, my own view has been from the start that there's quite a lot of jurisprudence around the First Amendment in the United States. There's a very interesting book which I recommend to anybody who's talking about this called The Shadow University, which discusses, because as you possibly know, if a university in the United States is a state university, then it's covered by the First Amendment. And so if there are attempts to restrict speech there, they can be tested in the courts. And it's much more complicated than it first appears. And the old, you can't shout fire in a crowded theatre, you can't incite violence, are not really quite enough. You have to recognise that the frontiers are a bit hazier than that. But the problem is that the concept of hate speech in the hands of the people who now dominate the academy and increasingly the media is one which can be used to shut up practically anything you don't like. And the success of what we have to call political correctness, because there is no other term which sums it up, has been driven hugely by the fact that it enforces good manners. It says to people you really shouldn't abuse various types of persons who you either disapprove of or don't like. And I think almost any civilized person has to say, well, that's a good thing. The nasty words which we use to describe various people in our society, even as recently as 20 years ago, I'm glad to see the back of them. And I get quite cross when people supposedly on my side start using such terms or yearning for their use. And so even I am sucked in by part of this. But the problem is who's enforcing this? And on what grounds? There's almost nothing which can't be classified as hate speech if you draw your lines broadly enough. And this is similar to the famous development after the first report into the Stephen Lawrence murder, where anything which anybody perceives as a racist remark therefore was a racist remark. It all becomes so subjective that there is no contesting it. And so you're basically in a position of lawlessness. Almost the worst form of lawlessness is one in which nobody actually knows what is legal. And this is increasingly becoming the case in speech. Nobody knows what is permissible and what is not. So people suddenly find themselves being caught out by sometimes stupid things which they would say in private but not in public, sometimes just by stupid things which they say. But there is a very unclear boundary, and I think that's always bad. It would be better if we could retreat, as I say, to the more carefully worked out limits of the First Amendment described in the Shadow University. But again, you can't have a First Amendment in this country, because the First Amendment is based on the idea that Congress is subject to the Constitution, whereas in this country Parliament is supreme, and so you could never do it. You couldn't make a law saying Parliament shall make no law restricting freedom of speech. We have to try and copy it in some other way. But as I say, I don't think that the prevalence of the idea of hate speech in the academy is a good thing. I think it means that speech is far too limited. And sometimes you have to pay a rather unpleasant price for free speech, because free speech is ultimately about allowing freedom to people you don't like, and sometimes people whose ideas you intensely dislike and whose manner of expressing them you intensely dislike. And I think the border has to be drawn so that you have to allow that, or otherwise it isn't free.
Yeah, very interesting. If we could sort of turn this discussion to a more general look at free speech and sort of free speech online, not just outside of universities. it seems like we've sort of reached a point where a few massive media companies sort of referee the online political dialogue in that sort of sphere. And at the same time that they claim to essentially be public utilities that anybody can use, they have sort of teams of moderators that make decisions to restrict or promote certain types of content. In your view, how far are they responsible for the content on their platforms? And have they been consistent in upholding that responsibility and enforcing their rules?
Well, I'll answer the second question first. I don't think they have been consistent. I think they're now getting quite worried that the way in which they're behaving makes them look increasingly like publishers, which would then make them much more subject to regulation. But on the other hand, who's going to take charge of this? The modern state is incredibly weak in the face of these giants, and it has surprisingly little power to do anything about it, especially when the modern state is defending freedom. If you have a modern state like that of China, which wants to suppress freedom, and it goes to some of the internet giants and says, will you help us do this? They have often responded by saying, well, yes, actually, we will. And I have sometimes described the modern world as the hideous love child of Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. There's a combination of wild free market capitalism and extremely repressive attitudes towards speech and thought. But combined, I have to say, with a very relaxed sexual morality. So the loins are free and the brain is under control. And I see this developing, and I don't get the impression that the big internet companies are full of people who carefully studied the nature of human freedom and who feel very strongly that it should be preserved. I'm not quite sure why it is that they take the how shall I put it, the limiting attitudes that they do take, but it's quite clear that they're not run by people who view freedom under the law as being the keystone of civilized society. They tend much more in the direction of utopianism and of believing that the utopia which they desire is so good that anybody who doesn't like it is not just wrong but bad. I see so many totalitarian tendencies among people who would never identify themselves or recognize themselves as totalitarians in modern society, and they seem to be present in the internet companies.
If I can just take this slightly more philosophically for a moment, I mean, I think my understanding of free speech and free thought is that when humans were first evolving, many millennia ago, it was the case that they were refereeing each other in terms of what they did. And then maybe a few centuries ago, it started being refereeing in terms of what each other was saying. Do you think we're turning up at the point now where it's more about what we think? Where we're refereeing what each other think?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily agree with you about the origins of this. I think it was a very happy accident that created, particularly in the Anglosphere countries, a form of freedom which has several almost unique characteristics. It's the adversarial parliament, the adversarial courtroom, the existence of jury trial, the presumption of innocence. These things are, as I say, incredible pieces of luck, which happens to this country, and which it handed on more or less to nobody else but the other Anglosphere countries, and then not completely. And it's worked extraordinarily well. But I'm afraid it's no longer valued or understood, and a lot of people decide they don't like it. It's very inconvenient to absolute power. If you have, for instance, people go on about the vote as if this was a decisive aspect of a free society. There are plenty of unfree societies which have votes, and votes are terribly easily manipulated if you have enough money and enough control of the major media to do so. The thing which two things in my view decisively ensure the freedom of the Anglosphere countries are jury trial with the presumption of innocence, which means the state can't just lock you up because it feels like it, and the development of adversarial parliaments, in which there is a constant opposition to the government, which is accepted as legitimate as part of the constitution, and creates the possibility of an alternative government and an inch of difference between the parties in which we all live. And those things have proved increasingly inconvenient and undesirable, and not understood either by most people now. I find the understanding of the liberties of this country very, very slender and very poorly educated in the schools and universities. So I just think people stop valuing them. But if you look at most of the world, there's never been much in the way of freedom of speech or free debate. They haven't really existed. And or if so, not for very long. And a lot of countries which come under the democratic banner are actually surprisingly repressive in reality. I don't myself believe that any country which has large-scale pre-trial detention can really be free, nor one where the presumption of innocence doesn't operate in practice, which jury trial compels. And we're surrounded by strong states which are formal democracies and have sort of free press and sort of free media. When you examine them, they're immensely less so than in the Anglosphere. So here we have this happy accident, which we've enjoyed the benefits of for a few centuries, but which is, I think, now coming to an end. I'm very sad to see it go, but I don't see any sign anybody wants to defend it very much.
On the basis of that, I'd be interested to hear your opinions on individuals like Julian Assange and Edward Snowden, who sort of pointed out the hypocrisy within governments, within institutions that sort of purport to follow these sort of historic, like you said, happy accidents that we've sort of come into as a freedom sort of loving society. What would you have to say about them and the steps that they've taken to sort of hold on to the sort of freedoms that we've been talking about?
Well, they're not exactly the same, Mr. Assange and Mr. Snowden, but in general, I think that I have, although I don't like Julian Assange very much, and I have some difficulties with some of the things that he says and does, I have very much opposed his extradition to the United States. And within limits, one has also to defend a lot of the things which people such as Edward Snowden have done, however much you worry that there are limits beyond which they may have trespassed. And that I try to be very much on the side of freedom in these things. But I've always been a bit vague on the details of the Snowden case, so I don't really want to get too involved in talking about it. In the Assange case, I have been involved because I found, to my surprise, I was one of very few British journalists who was prepared to say openly that he shouldn't be extradited, which came as a shock to me as well as to others.
Yeah, that seems like an incredible shock.
I'm unequivocal about that.
That seems like that's an incredible shock to me, that you sort of stood alone with journalists that sort of purport to hold fast to free speech, that they would...
Yeah, the fact that it was me doing it as well, of all people, it's extraordinary. But there it is. It tells you a very interesting thing, I think, about the modern left, particularly in journalism, which is the left used to be reliably on the side of two things. It was on the side of civil liberty against overmighty states, and it tended to be suspicious of wars of choice. And now I find, dealing with left-wing journalists, they tend to be quite enthusiastic about wars of choice. And the enthusiasm for going to war in Syria, for instance, on the political and journalistic left in my country is extraordinary. And also utterly uninterested in defending Julian Assange. I disagree that The Guardian did eventually come out and say quite clearly that it was against his extradition, but it took a while for them to do so, it seems to me, and it wasn't as if many of their individual writers had come out and said the same thing. And I think the reason for this is the left is now in power. And the wars of choice which are now being proposed tend to be idealistic wars rather than cynical ones. And therefore they're more inclined to support them. I'm still slightly baffled by the intensity of the desire to go to war with Syria, a country whose government I find repellent, and have said so on the record for many years. I still don't know exactly why is it that there is such a desire to go to war in that direction. I don't know, but it does seem to me that as the left gets closer to power, which it has done in the huge cultural and moral revolution over the past 50 years, the less interested it is in liberty and the more interested it is in making war.
Well, you sort of indicated that it is the left that's in power. I'd like to sort of push you on exactly what you meant there, because, I mean, in the UK, there is a conservative government. You mentioned the sort of necessity of that sort of adversarial parliament, and it sort of seems like the UK and the US still have this adversarial system
Oh, but we have them technically, but actually, I wouldn't want to speak about the United States. I've always found American politics hard to penetrate, and let's stick to the country I do know, which is my own. The British Parliament has not been adversarial for some years. What happened was, first of all, Blairism, which is basically Euro-communism, triumphed at the polls and then triumphed culturally. What had happened for the previous 50 years is that Britain had been undergoing a sexual, moral, cultural, and educational revolution, but not as yet a political one. The 1997 victory of New Labour meant that the people who'd been victorious in that cultural revolution were now politically in power as well. And one of their main intentions, particularly with the gigantic majority they had on first election, was to browbeat and club the Conservative Party into accepting their policies. And under David Cameron, that's what the Conservative Party did. Of course, the modern equivalent of the Vatican in Britain is the BBC, which is the body which bestows blessings and approval on political parties and which prevented the Conservative Party from having the faintest chance of winning any elections between 1997 and 2010. And as soon as the Tory party adopted Blairism, the BBC was prepared to treat it fairly again. It began to see some chance of coming to office. But the two parties are essentially identical. The Conservative Party may call itself the Conservative Party, but that's never meant much, and it means nothing now. There is it's great. I have quite a lot of fun. I have somewhere on my bookshelves behind me a little manual put out by the German Democratic Republic, Communist East Germany in the 80s, about all the wonderful policies they were pursuing. Most of them are indistinguishable from the policies now adopted by the Conservative Party of the Conservative Unionist Party of Britain. So the extent of the transformation of Western Conservative parties into politically correct, say, cultural, moral, social, and educational radical parties seems to me to be underappreciated, to put it mildly, but there's no doubt about it. And as for the people who, my generation, the long march through the institutions lot, the people who were at university in the late 60s and early 70s, some of them were like me. I was very specifically, ideologically, dogmatically Marxist-Leninist, and I read the stuff and took it all seriously at the time. Many, many more people were sort of vaguely revolutionary, but didn't get as theoretically engaged, and continued to be revolutionary once they went into the careers which they then followed, particularly in education, in the law, in journalism, and of course in the undergrowth of politics, this is the special advisor industry and all that, where so many of them ended up. And what you find if you look, and I wrote a long article about this a couple of years ago, is that a very large number of members of Blair's cabinet were supposedly former Trotskyists or communists. Now, how former were they? Everyone will come back to me and say, but you used to be a Trotskyist. Of course I was, but the thing is, different between me and, say, Alan Milburn or Stephen Byers or Blair himself, is that I talk about it. I'm absolutely frank about it. You ask me anything about my time as a Trotskyist, I'll tell you as factually as I can what I did, what I thought, who I associated with, what I was up to. Blair himself did not admit to having been a Trotskyist until about 2 years ago, years after he'd stopped being in active electoral politics. You won't get Byers or Milburn or Alistair Darling or most of the others, or Peter Mandelson, to talk about their time in Marxist organisations, because it still matters. And how many of them were there? We don't know. I tried to get my MI5 records a few years ago, and they told me eventually that under some pretext they wouldn't give them to me. I think the reason why they wouldn't give them to me is that in the early years of New Labour, all the MI5 records of what were then called left-wing subversives were destroyed. So we have no way of finding out. But I'll bet you there are a lot more people in New Labour who were actually on the revolutionary left in the 1960s and 1970s than we've ever found out. And you only need to look at the ideas they pursued to see them. But they're not. We moved on from seizing the barracks and the railway station and the post office to seizing the television studio and the newspaper and the school. And it's been a Gramscian revolution, not a Leninist one, and that's the big difference. But that, apart from anything else, it's a lot easier, isn't it? You can carry on pursuing a very nice, well-paid career in television while still being a Gramscian revolutionary. It would be much harder to do that if you're a Leninist.
I think it would be a real waste of our conversation with you today if we didn't at least ask a couple of questions relating to Brexit. And I appreciate you don't have a magic ball in which you can predict the future, but I'd like to ask you this. Originally, it seemed that other EU countries over the next couple of decades might follow the UK in leaving the EU as well, and then it started to look less likely. Do you expect that the EU will lose more member states in the short to medium term, and why or why not?
I've never thought so. I think there's always been a possibility that the EU might resolve itself into two different blocks, a central one heading towards ever closer union and an outer group less enthusiastic about it. But most of the new members of the past 30 years have joined the EU because of the advantages they believe they'd get from it and the protection they thought it would give them. I don't think they're in any hurry to leave. I think the idea that lots of other people wanted to do the same as Britain has always been a fantasy of the more, how shall I put it, romantic pro-exit people. I don't see it. The reason why Britain has always had a difficulty with the European Union, the reason why I, for a long time, thought that our membership of it was incompatible with our existence as a state, is the particular difference between our laws and theirs. Apart from the Republic of Ireland, there is no other country in the European Union which has laws which are not more or less Roman civil code. They don't have common law. They don't have the true presumption of innocence in their criminal code, and they operate as a result completely differently. And so that always seemed to me to be the reason why fundamentally we couldn't stay in. I was never particularly worried about the trading arrangements. In fact, I as you possibly know, favoured the Norway option of staying in the single market. I'd have stayed in the customs union if I could. I could see absolutely no point in having a huge economic rupture. What I wanted was to get our political and legal institutions out of the European stream and allow them to continue to develop independently. So I think it's a fantasy of a certain type of person to believe that the European Union is on the verge of collapse. Most of the countries which have joined the European Union did so by elite decision, but their elites had completely open eyes about what they were doing. The British elite was deeply divided about joining the European Union, and could see grave disadvantages in it, and almost certainly made a wrong decision at the time because of the catastrophic demoralisation which followed our national failure and defeat at Suez, caused the British governing class to go more or less doolally, and they looked for anywhere to make up for this humiliation, and they turned to the European Union as a mistake. We could always have been on good terms with them without joining, but Macmillan was absolutely set on joining, and we're stuck with this result. And having joined, having gone deep into it, we now find that the penalties for leaving, which of course are not getting much attention because of the coronavirus crisis, are very heavy. And the City of London loses its first position to Amsterdam, and this is an enormous development, hardly noticed. Large numbers of small businesses are suffering greatly because of the problems of third country status. And the fishing industry is in a terrible mess, and all kinds of other things of this kind are going to come up. I think that Britain has many more problems with the form of exit it's chosen than the European Union has. I'm not saying the European Union is without internal problems and difficulties. It has huge ones. And the single currency is going to create enormous strain over and over and over again, already has done, particularly in the case of Greece. And I think Cyprus as well. But that doesn't mean it's going to fall apart. Or it would be particularly good for anyone in Britain if it did.
It's sort of easy to get embroiled in the sort of instant effects of Brexit on the UK economy, the European economy, and sort of get bogged down in the details there. But I'd like to sort of push you on a more American-style sort of Brexit argument and ask how far you sympathize with the sort of American federalist view that the UK should have left, or England and the UK should have left the EU because of authority and political authority being as close to the people as possible, and that more structural argument.
Well, that is more or less my argument. I think Britain should have its own sovereign parliament, and it should make its own laws and should reform its own laws according to that Parliament and within its own sovereign boundaries. And I also think it should control its own borders. Two things which we had lost, more or less, under the old dispensation. But it's quite amusing to hear that from the United States, because it was the United States which actually played a large part in propelling us into the European Union in the first place. And there was actually a CIA operation designed to support this program. It's one of the few that's ever been documented, because someone found all the papers in a cupboard at Georgetown University. The United States is always very keen on Britain being absorbed into some sort of European superstate, so that they could have one telephone number when it came to Europe. And the United States is so different from Britain in so many ways that to try and impose American, how should I put it, states' rights politics onto the European continent is never really going to work. American states, fine organs as they are, don't really compare with fully formed nation states with long histories and their own armies, monarchs, currencies, and all the rest of it. Sovereignty is not about national anthems and flags. It's about these hard things that you either have or you don't have.
Yeah, interesting point. One of the most fascinating aspects to current UK politics is Scotland's fervent desire to continue pushing for independence and, in the meantime, for economic self-determination. What do you expect Scotland's future will look like?
I think Scotland will leave the United Kingdom. I think it's almost certainly inevitable now. I don't think anyone in London has come up with any formula which can counter the extremely clever propagandising of the Scottish National Party and the national mood in Scotland, sort of post-Braveheart mood, which is emotionally for independence. And it's very hard to counter these things, as Spain is discovering as well in Catalonia. The tougher they are on the Catalonian independence movement, the more it seems to consolidate itself. So I resigned to that departure. I think whatever opportunity there may have been to prevent it was lost when the Blairites brought in the devolution in the first place. They thought it would actually end the desire for independence, for in fact it fed it. So I think we just have to cope with it. And my view has for a long time been to say to Scotland, we're very sorry if you want to go, we can't prevent you. But you're completely welcome to come back whenever you like. It. We'll leave a light burning, but there's no bitterness about it. Who has campaigned for a British independence from European decision-making, who can turn to the Scots to say, how dare you ask for independence in decision-making? Who has been the victim of Project Fear stuff about, if you do that, there'll be economic disaster, can turn to the Scots and start threatening them with economic disaster if they secede. It's totally inconsistent. I don't regret. I love Scotland. My earliest memories are of Scotland, and I'd be very sorry to see it go. But I don't think it can be prevented by either threats or anger or coldness. If there is a formula for keeping Scotland in the Union, it very much is just to say no nation should keep itself together by force. If you really don't want to stay, then please leave. But remember, we will keep the door open, and if ever you want to come back, we'll move heaven and earth to get you back in again with the least possible problem. I think that might be a much better key to if not preventing it, meaning that it's in the long term, maybe there is a chance of reunification. But honestly, it's particularly for people who've been associated with the campaign to leave the European Union, it's very difficult for them to oppose what Scotland is doing. And also, bitterness in these things is futile. We made the most terrible mess of Ireland in the early years of the 20th century, which ended with the catastrophic executions of the leaders of the Easter Rising, which is a mistake which will echo down history forever. And we really should be very careful not to go down the same road of bitterness with Scotland. If that's what they want, then that's what they must have. Countries are entitled to be independent if they desire it. If the Scottish people wish it, they must have it and go with our blessing.
If I could turn the discussion a little bit more towards the University of York, because as many listeners will know, you're one of the notable alumnus from the University of York, and I'm correct.
Well, Challenge doesn't think so. Whenever they compile their teams of York alumni, I always get left off it.
Well, you're on it. You're on it now, Mr. Hitchens.
But yeah, okay. Thanks.
You're on it now. How far
I
would
just
you
throw
say?
that in because it cheeses me off.
How far would you say that your politics and philosophy degree from the university prepared you for sort of your long career as a leading political columnist and a pundit?
Oh, not at all, because I didn't do any work. I spent my entire time at York as an active Bolshevik, studying Marxism-Leninism, and because things were so relaxed in those days, I got away with it. And that certainly had an impact. I mean, the fact that they let me get on with what I was doing, because I took, as I do, actually, I took the whole thing to the limits. I'd like to take an idea to its logical conclusions, and I was able to do that in the York of those days, which is one of the reasons why I'm so much not a Leninist Bolshevik now. So I owe to York the fact that that far from being a Bolshevik, I'm now, for goodness sake, a communicant member of the Church of England. Not a place I travelled very much with my activities at the time, but that's what I am now. That's where I owe that to York, beyond doubt. Lots of other things too. I had a lot of fun at York.
So I want to push you just a little bit more on the sort of Leninism, Trotskyism sort of avenue of our discussion. And please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like perfect. Please correct me if I'm wrong, but it seems like your political sort of understanding comes from a sort of principled stand in combination with sort of nuanced understanding of real political issues. Where did you come into that understanding, and was it sort of after university, at the university, and how far did that sort of Leninist, Marxist, Trotskyist idea that you once held factor into that sort of turn?
You're gazing, you may not understand this or realize how unique your experience. You're gazing at an extinct creature. I'm like that coelacanth, which occasionally gets hauled up from the depths of the sea. I ought to exist. I was brought up in circumstances which are no longer imaginable to most people. My father was an officer of the Royal Navy, so I grew up in and around naval bases and listening to the things which people of that kind thought. I was educated at cathedral choir schools, amongst other places. And I grew up in an England so wholly different from the one that anybody now experiences that it's hard even to begin to explain the mixture of patriotism and faith and duty with which I was inculcated at an early stage. And I then went through a second stage, the gradual understanding of an 11, 12-year-old boy of the Perfumer affair, and increasingly as I grew older of the Suez catastrophe which had preceded it. And I realized that what I had been brought up to believe had been discredited about this country. And also the people who had taught me this had lost their authority in the ludicrous performance of the Perfumer affair. And so I was a person with a profound faith and nowhere to put it. And when I discovered in my teens the powerful attractions, and there's no doubt of them, of revolutionary socialism, I embraced them because I had a huge gap in my life which they filled. The problem was that they then went on to disappoint me as well. It became clear as I lived my life that they weren't actually applicable to reality. So I had to drop that, and I spent many years in a wilderness of doubt and unknowing, not knowing where to turn. And where I am now is as a result of that. I think if I was still a Marxist, I'd say something about thesis, antithesis, and synthesis here, but that's where I am. I do know that I can and have changed my mind, and I'm conscious, therefore, that I could change it again, which means that I believe hugely in the tolerance of opposing opinions, and in trying as far as possible to be civil and rational in argument, which is a principle. I also hate utopianism. I became extraordinarily suspicious of utopianism, and I saw it as a way to bloodshed and misery. But of course, it was an attractive way of bloodshed and misery. It looks nice until you're a long way down the path, and you suddenly realise where you've gone. So I thought it was a duty to be against that. My other great advantage is more than 40 years in what I call the University of Fleet Street, where I've been extraordinarily fortunate in having lived in the final months of the Soviet Union seemed collapse, as who traveled greatly in many, many countries which are not free, or which are utterly different from this country. And so I've had also a second education, which has very much brought home to me the need for tolerance and for preserving the freedom that we have, especially, and also made me very, very hostile to going abroad and telling other people how to run their countries, which seems to me to be none of our business. So all these things put together, the early years growing up as a patriot and Christian, the disillusion, the embrace of revolutionary socialism, the long years unanchored by any real belief, the return to Christianity, the enormous educational power of travel as a journalist to other countries has left me with what I very, very much fear is a unique respect for liberty under the law and the unique desire not to make war on other people. But these still seem to me to be opinions worth expressing and getting across as many people as possible before I die.
I think we've got time for just one more question now, Peter, and I think it's one whose answer will be valuable to any York student studying any of the degree programs covered by philosophy, politics, and economics. And it's simply this: what advice would you give to York PPE students listening to this who may want to follow on and find success on a similar career path to yours?
I can't. There is no recipe for success. Now, I've been extraordinarily fortunate. Providence has smiled on me again and again, and it may not on other people. I have to say, in the course of my long life, there have been moments when I've despaired of the trade that I was in and been extremely dispirited and thought seriously of leaving it. And that often these things happen the moment before the most enormous strokes of good fortune, which transform life. So one thing to be aware of is that you really do not know what's going to happen next. But I'm not an advocate of or an advisor of success or how to make friends or influence people, things I'm very bad at in both cases. What I would say is that if you want to seek a good life, then you really need, if you're interested in reforming anything, the thing you need to reform most of all is yourself, that there are genuine rewards in that, and that in pursuing any career, I think particularly if it's a career to do with politics or journalism or the law or anything like that, always keep in mind the Christian virtues, which are not accidental, but are vital to the living of life. You will fail on many occasions to abide by them. I certainly have. But on the other hand, they will give you a purpose and a definition and a quality in your life which you'll otherwise not achieve. It's the only form of idealism which I can really endorse, because it sets out to reform the individual who embraces it rather than telling other people what to do or making other people do things. So that's it. I'd say while you're doing your course, whatever it is, slip into the Minster one evening at evensong, hide behind a pillar, play no part in it, but let the haunting rhythms of the eternal into your life, and it won't do any harm.
Well, I'd like to say thank you for coming on, Peter Hitchens. It's been a pleasure speaking with you.
Thank you very much.
Well, it's nice of you to ask me. Thanks a lot.
Lovely.